Welcome to PHADA's webinar, Congressional Advocacy and Hot Topics in Washington. Today's webcast will feature PHADA President Mark Gillett of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, PHADA Trustee Terry Lee of Atlanta, Georgia, and PHADA Executive Director Tim Kaiser, along with PHADA policy staff. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment and review the logistics of today's event. We will be taking questions throughout the discussion. At any time during the webcast, please use the Q&A link in the toolbar to submit your questions. We ask that you do not use the chat function, as we will not be monitoring this for audience questions. All articles, resources in this webinar will be listed in the webinar resource document that will be posted in the chat. We are recording the webinar and will make it available on PHADA's website following today's presentation. And as a reminder, the discussions in this webcast are not for media use. For quotes and more information, please contact PHADA directly. And now we'd like to introduce PHADA Executive Director, Tim Kaiser.
Thank you, and thank you all out there for taking the time to join us this morning for this session on congressional advocacy and some of the hot topics of the day. We are in the midst of the 118th Congress, which started back in January. I'm sure you all recall the lengthy debates we had about the new speaker and the many roll calls it took for Speaker McCarthy to be elected. The time has gone fast. Since that development, we had a lengthy debate this year about the debt ceiling and the $32 trillion national debt. Ultimately, the White House and Congress agreed to a bipartisan deal suspending the debt ceiling until January 2025. It's a 2-year deal that sets strict caps on domestic discretionary spending. So appropriators will face very tight limits on increases in their various appropriations bills. Basically, this year, we're looking at potentially flatline funding with perhaps a small increase, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But of course, you all out there at agencies are having to deal with some significant inflationary pressures that make your job even more difficult. Now, shortly after the bipartisan deal was agreed to, a new twist occurred with the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Representative Kay Granger, stating that the limits in the domestic discretionary part of the bill were a ceiling. And so she announced that because of the large debt the country's facing, the House was going to develop legislation with lower funding levels. And of course, the Senate, the White House vehemently disagreed with that approach. There was immediately talk about the possibility of this resulting in a government shutdown. But nevertheless, appropriators have started working on their appropriations bills. PHADA has been reporting on those. I encourage you to review our website, editions of The Advocate, for information. We are now in the August recess. Congress is at home until after Labor Day, and they'll come back, and they'll only have 3 weeks to develop a fiscal year 24 budget, because the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. So most observers believe we're going to be looking at yet another continuing resolution. We're not quite sure how long that CR would be in place. It's really important, though, that Congress get the budget done, certainly by the 1st of next year, because if that does not happen, we could be looking at automatic 1% cuts across the board. So PHADA has been meeting with some of the main appropriations staff here in Washington, up on Capitol Hill. We've been stressing our priorities. Certainly, we prefer the Senate version, which is more generous than the House appropriations bill. We wanted to talk, though, about the importance of you all meeting with your representatives and your senators, whether it be in the district or for when you come to PHADA's Washington meeting next month. There's an old cliche, former speaker Tip O'Neill, about 40 years ago, said that all politics is local. And what he meant by that was that elected officials are most responsive to their constituents, to people in their communities and districts. That is why it's so important for you to talk with your elected officials, your representatives and your senators. And we want to focus on that for a little bit today. So we're going to talk about how to set those meetings, things you want to stress, and include some helpful hints. So with that, I will now turn it over to David Weber, who will talk a little bit about those kinds of logistics. David?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Go to the next slide. So when you're, that contact is important. It's telling me my internet is unstable. Is important, and you could find contact information at house.gov. There's a zip code lookup to find your representative. Senate.gov has a drop down by state, and most of the representatives and senators' websites have various means to contact them. You can request a meeting sometimes and other things right via the website. It's also always good to get both DC and local phone numbers and just make contact, follow up if you've sent a request through the website to let them know. Some years ago, PHADA and some partners developed the Advocacy and Planning Guide for Housing Authorities, which is subtitled a step-by-step guide. It has a lot of really great resources and tips. You can browse it and pick out the pieces that you want, and that will be most useful. Oh, am I still frozen? Let me turn my camera off. Can you all hear me now? Okay, is that better? So as I say, we have the Advocacy and Planning Guide, which has great resources. Some of the links, especially around developing your message, are a little bit dated, but most of the resources are still excellent. Next slide, please. It's also always good to have information to give to and to leave with staffers, as well as your representatives and senators. In the next, by Friday, we'll have our fiscal year 24 appropriations position paper, as well as our PHADA legislative priorities. Those will also be in the next Advocate. And so you can certainly use those things. There's a lot of information also on our website that could be very valuable. The HUD budget and appropriations has a number of documents that we've prepared over the last several months. The legislation and advocacy tab will provide a lot of other information. And of course, the regulatory comments, you can see exactly what we've submitted in some of the letters that we've sent. And then of course, your past advocates. The planning guide does include a little template for developing like a little one pager on your own organization, which is always useful to let them know not just who you are, but who you serve. And sometimes you can add in your priority concerns or issues that you would like to highlight with your representatives. Next slide, please. It's also always useful to work collaboratively with others who may be represented by the same elected official. So if you're going to the Hill to meet with your senator, you can gather everyone from your state and go together. You can do that with representatives' offices as well. One way to do that is through the HUVA app. And as you can see on this slide, there's a couple of ways to identify who else from your state is attending, as well as you can browse who's attending, which also indicates their location. You can also, if you logged into the PHADA website, you can also search membership and organization by state from that member search on our website from the Member Center. So really appreciate that. It's now my pleasure to introduce PHADA President and Executive Director of Oklahoma City Housing Authority, Mark Gillett, and PHADA Trustee from the Atlanta Housing Authority, Terry Lee.
Thank you, David. Thank you also to Tim, Sarah, and again, David and Michael and Crystal and Blake for putting this session together. I think there's nothing more important than our work to promote and improve affordable housing with our elected officials. Again, my name is Mark Gillett. I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma City Housing Authority, and for the next 2 years, I have the honor of serving as the President of PHADA. I think you'll notice that as we talk about congressional advocacy, we'll repeat ourselves today. And I just want to say it's not that we didn't coordinate our presentations, it is that those items that we repeat are very, very important points, and we want us to all remember them. We are focusing today on congressional representation, contacting those folk. But it's also important that we remember the local city council folk, our county commissioners, our state representatives, and especially our supervisors, our board members. So each of those folk need information, and each of those need our attention. So specifically, how do you go about contacting an elected official? PHADA staff, as David had just pointed out, have provided you with a link so that you can search for your representatives. I recommend that if you don't already know those names and know where those offices are located, that immediately after the session today, you go and you search for those folk. The national representatives will usually prefer you contact them via a web inquiry through their own website. But it's perfectly fine for you just to call their main number. Now, it's important to realize that most folk that represent us in Washington, D.C. also have a local office. And I really recommend you start at the local level. But if you're going to be going to the PHADA Legislative Conference in just a little over a month now, go ahead and call that DC office so that you can arrange a meeting with the DC office. So after you've made that call and you tell them your name and where you work, I really recommend that you specifically say, I'd like to request a meeting with a staff person. And I like the staff person that works with affordable housing or community development programs. I want you to realize that I didn't say I want a meeting with the elected official. So I think if those of us that work at medium to large public housing authorities know, we surround ourselves with staff that are experts in a field. PHADA surrounds himself with experts in the field of different types of housing. And that is the same for an elected official in Washington, D.C. No one person can understand the intricacies of all of the programs. And so the staff person is by far the most important person to start with. They will have access to the elected official and be able to present the opinion that you have offered to them. So I want to give a specific example of how working with the staff can affect the relationship with a representative. On the screen are some pictures that were taken here in Oklahoma City with Representative Cole. Representative Cole became the chair of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Committee, or PHADA, as we like to refer to it, as after the last election. I contacted Representative Cole's field staff director and met with that individual. I don't imagine that it would have been ever that Representative Cole had had a briefing on public housing or affordable housing or Section 8. He had never been involved with those committees in the past, but now he was the chair of that committee. And I felt like it was part of my responsibility to brief him and to introduce him to the subject of affordable housing. Now, I had a great meeting with the field director, and at that meeting, we determined that it would be a good idea for Representative Cole during his next visit in Oklahoma City to visit a public housing development. So we arranged that meeting, and that was a great meeting. It was one of the best meetings I've ever had with an elected official, being honest with you. We used it from our staff point as an opportunity to educate Representative Cole and to educate the staff so they could truly understand what capital fund did to a building, what public housing funds did, how it works with a resident rent, how Section 8 works with a resident rent. It was a very basic meeting, but a very good meeting that we were able to use to educate him. But as a result of that meeting, Representative Cole, who had just become the THUD chair, asked if the national THUD staff and Cole's DC staff could come and visit the Public Housing Authority, because he wanted them to truly understand what goes on at the local PHA. Remember, they're all set aside in their Washington, DC offices, and they don't have the true picture of what occurs at the local PHA level. So sure, we had that meeting. They came, they sent about 10 folk to Oklahoma City, and we toured a couple of public housing developments, traditional public housing developments. We toured a rental assistance demonstration site so they could see that difference. And then we toured an affordable assisted living site that uses a flexibility of programming to operate. So it was a great opportunity and a great session. And then the big benefit from that was that the next Monday morning, Tim Kaiser and I were sitting in the THUD office. And so I was then able to relate to that staff person, hey, you just saw how this program works in this location, and that's how it can work across the board. And so that is why this type of a program is very beneficial. So let's take a step back for a moment. And those of you that know Oklahoma know that I am faced with the fact that most, if not all, of Oklahoma's national representatives are not exactly likely to vote in favor of expanded funding for housing. In fact, that's how the majority of the conversations I have go with staff people and with elected officials. It usually starts out, I'm not going to be able to give you more funding. That's not what the party suggests. And so as a result of those sessions, I then say that I would prefer to talk about things like regulatory relief. I talked to them about how during COVID, there wasn't a lot of regulations that were released. And then now, after COVID and the life we're all living in now, they seem to be trying to catch up and throw different regulation and different regulation and different regulation on top of us all at once. And we would like that lessened. We're tired of that administrative burden. And that resonates well with representatives from that side of the aisle. And then I always tell them my second request is flexibility. It's what we all used to call moving to work in the industry, but now we're kind of trying to use the word flexibility. That's flexibility of programs and flexibility of funding. so that we can truly use programs to combine them together to provide different options. And in Oklahoma City, I like to show them the John H. Johnson Affordable Care Suites, a program that uses Section 8, a program that uses Medicaid, a program that uses Medicare, a program that uses supplemental Social Security income. All of those programs flex together so that they can offer true affordable housing to those in need. So at the end of the session, those are two things that most people can walk out remembering. Walk out remembering that we want regulatory relief and we want flexibility. That's what I try to leave them with during my meetings. So I think Terry will take over now and begin to visit with us more about how she approaches meetings with her representatives.
Thank you, Mark. And I would also like to take this opportunity and just thank our PHADA team. I believe this topic is not only an important topic, but it's also a timely topic. Again, my name is Terry Lee, and I have the privilege and honor to serve as the Chief Operating Officer for Atlanta Housing here in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta Housing services about 27,000 households a year, constituting about 46,000 individuals that we touch in a variety of ways through our rental assistance programs, our family self-sufficiency programs, as well as development activity. But today, we're here to talk about how do we meet with our legislators. And as Mark stated, some of the items we talked through may sound repetitive, but please know that doesn't take away the importance of each individual item. Mark has given you a very practical, tactical approach in working with your legislators and getting them to understand the work that we do right here on the ground, but also their relationship to it. Here, I would like to walk you through just different topics, understanding how relationships matter, the importance of the meeting, what you should cover in the meeting, and how you should prepare. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So relationships are important. We've heard this from the beginning of time. And the best way to get someone to answer your call is if the first time you call them or you reach out to them is when you don't have a problem. More specifically, in working with our legislators, it's really important because when you're working with a divided Congress, every vote matters. It's also critically important that as many of us apply for funding from not just HUD, but other federal departments, you never know what support you can receive from your congressional office and how that letter of support may make the difference when you're a half a point away of being selected. And then our legislators have a larger audience. They have a larger arena of being able to communicate a message. They are literally touching thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and those individuals can be impactful in the work that we attempt to lift up. Next slide, please. When you know you need to schedule your meeting, so it's very, very important to understand the staffing representatives in Washington, D.C., as well as in your local office. One of the things that we like to do here in Atlanta is actually start with the local office first. If we know that we're making a visit to DC and we're planning to schedule a meeting, we want our folks right here at home to understand that we want a meeting, that we're scheduling, and these are the items that we'll speak about. And it's important. It's important that we understand locally what our politics are. So even while you're scheduling a meeting with your different legislators or representatives, you want to understand what are they also hearing from the local unit of government, as well as the state government. What things are important? Because the last thing you want to do, even if you're advocating for different messages, is look as if you're advocating in a very controversial manner. And so you want to understand your politics. Now, sometimes it can be very hard to get a meeting in Washington. And sometimes it can be hard to get a meeting locally. But the importance of starting early is really key to being able to make the difference and making sure that you can utilize the meeting to your best benefit. And that takes us to the next slide of preparing for your meeting. You have to be very, very clear and concise and understand what points are you trying to get across. As Mark stated, what are the 2 or 3 things that you want to leave an everlasting impact and effect? So if you have to make a phone call to follow up, that the individuals that you met with understand what's important, not only to your agency, but also the constituents that you serve. And so it's really critical that you have your elevator pitch. And while that may sound elementary, practicing 2 or 3 things that have to be a part of your messaging is really, really critical to make sure that you have a successful discussion and a successful conversation. So many times in our world that we speak of, we always speak about units, we speak about funding, how much something costs, but at the end of the day, it really is about people. Why housing is your outcome, the impact is how you're changing someone's life. And so our representatives, because every vote matters, want to know how we're touching the people within their individual districts, within their individual territory, and how are people benefiting from the services that you provide. We recently adopted our strategic plan for Atlanta housing, and it sets forth how we will operate over the next 5 years, but more importantly, how we will have a people-centric approach to delivering housing services. We made sure that every last one of our local as well as state and federal representatives had a copy of that strategic plan along with a cheat sheet of sorts so that they can understand our plan is not just about building housing and funding that may be needed, but it's really understanding the people that we serve and the people that will benefit from our activities. Now, when you think about your issues, not just locally, but also issues from a federal perspective, it's really critical that you align yourself with our advocacy groups. The messaging has to be in sync and important. Myself, serving as a trustee with PHADA, I always want to make sure that when I'm speaking to our representatives, that I'm not just speaking about what's needed for the housing authority on a local level, but I also want to touch some of the items that have been talked about by PHADA and that PHADA is advocating for on a federal level. The best source for that is the advocate. Absolute best source is a timely publication, and Tim and his team do an excellent job of keeping all of our membership up to date on critical and pertinent issues. And so it does not hurt to make sure that you're familiar with those issues that the advocacy group is presenting, as well as any position papers that have been put forth. We know Congress will be moving forward with a budget pretty soon, and so we need to understand what our advocacy groups are saying about those and the items that are important to us as members. And although you're going to have your elevator pitch, if the conversation goes extremely well and there is extra time, make sure you have 2 or 3 things in your pocket that you want to speak about and that you would like to, again, continue to impress upon. Those 2 or 3 things could probably necessarily not be about your housing authority, but maybe understand the work that the legislators are doing on Capitol Hill. Understand what committees they're serving on. Understand what wins they've had in their individual district. And that way you're showing that the meeting is not just about me, but I understand the importance of your work and the importance of your commitment to your district and to your constituents. Next slide, please. As you look to make the meeting a win, and the win has to be for both parties. The win has to be for you as an individual, but also, well, really for 3 parties, for you as an individual, for the individual agency that you actually serve, and then also for the congressional representatives that you're speaking to. First and foremost, I believe in dressing for success. You want to make sure that you're not slashing, but that you dress in such a way that it separates you from the lobbyists that are on Capitol Hill every day, and the staff, and that the staffers can remember you. Also, patience is a virtue. Oftentimes, and this happens to us in our day-to-day work as well, meetings can get pushed back. Priorities can come before your meeting. So you may have to wait. And so also as you schedule your meeting, keep that in mind. Keep in mind that something may come up and your meeting may be pushed back 30 minutes or even an hour. So if you're scheduling multiple meetings on the Hill, you may want to make sure you take that into consideration. You also want to make sure that you give consideration to every individual staff member. It doesn't cost anything to be nice, and it doesn't cost anything to be courteous. And I've often been taught that you get more bees with honey. And so while you're working with the individual staffers, you want to make sure that the memory they have of you is a pleasant memory and not one of someone who is disgruntled. You also want to make sure that you leave with the individual staffers just information about your agency. You want to have a short letter that reiterates the 2 to 3 items that you spoke about, but at the same time, not necessarily have an ask, but remind them of the importance of the work that we do, the importance of that relationship to people, and how their continued partnership will take us to the next level in the services that we provide. Next slide, please. So after you've been successful in having a meeting, and keep in mind, oftentimes you may not meet with your congressional representative. You may meet with the staffers, and that's just as viably important. And that commitment and conversation that you can have with the staffers can often take you further than even a meeting with your representatives. And so you want to make sure that within 2 to 3 days, very short time period, that you send a letter of thanks. Because keep in mind, they could have always declined to have the meeting, and they saw fit to give you space and time. So you want to make sure that you're courteous and thankful and grateful for that opportunity. You also want to send a meet and recap. You know, our legislators and our aides, they meet with thousands and thousands of people over the course of the month. And so what was so different about your conversation versus something else that was said in a meeting with another individual? So you want to just recap the items that were discussed, and you want to make sure that, especially if you meet in Washington, D.C., that you make available the opportunity when the staffer or the legislator is back in your hometown. You want to make sure that you give them the opportunity to come visit some of the projects you have, as well as learn more about your agency. That's really important. So when we had in Georgia about 2 or 3 years ago, we had a significant change in our congressional representation. And so Congresswoman Williams, of course, took the seat for Congressman John Lewis, but we also had Reverend Warnock as well as Senator Ossoff take office. We made a very concerted effort to meet with each individual representative right here in Atlanta. Some came to our office, some we went to their office, but it was important for us to make sure that they understood not just the work of the Atlanta Housing Authority, but that Atlanta Housing was here to be a resource and an aid. That came in very handy with Senator Ossoff on one of the committees he served. When he had questions about a particular item, his staff reached out to our team to basically receive guidance and understand how his vote would impact the services that we actually provide here in Atlanta. Next slide, please. And so you want to, again, relationships. We talked about that a little earlier in just starting the process of scheduling your meeting. Keep in mind, you do not have to speak to your senator. It is not absolutely important. While you desire to speak to your senator and you would want to be able to have that face time, keep in mind, speaking with the staffers and working with the staffers may even take you further because they're the ones that are doing the day-to-day work. And as an old quote that we say in our agency, Washington is clearly run by 25-year-olds. And so we want to make sure that every staffer knows our name and knows the work that we're putting forth. We also want to make sure that our legislators and staffers understand any events we're having. Here in Atlanta, we received our Second Choice Neighborhood Award on last week, and Congresswoman Nikema Williams attended the event. However, we had staffers from Senator Warnock's office and Senator Ossoff's office, and we treated the staffers as if they were the congressmen, because we recognize having their participation in our groundbreaking, having their participation in the celebratory activities we have also help to add to their wins and to the support that they can provide to our city as we move forward. And then, you know, don't bombard, right? So you want to be informative, you want to be inclusive, but you do not want to become a nuisance to the legislative staff. And so you want to be very careful that as you're reaching out to the staff, that you're doing so in a manner that provides some level of concrete results, but at the same time is respectful of their time as well. You have to preserve your political capital. And as we move to the next slide and just think through additional considerations, every state is different and every state has different lobbying limits, different rules and regulations. And so if your state is one that has very stringent rules as to how your authority could actually lobby, then it's really good to use your trade groups. PHADA does an excellent job of keeping its membership educated, but also utilize those resources and those relationships to help schedule meetings in case you are not able to do at your state level. And so again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you, and I look forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you, Mark and Terry. Those are excellent suggestions that I think you've offered. And we again want to encourage those of you who are planning to come to PHADA's meeting in Washington next month to arrange those sessions or to hold such meetings in your district. They're both very valuable. Mark mentioned that there's been a real onslaught of new regulations and requirements coming out of the department. And PHADA has been attempting to address those, the voluminous amount of regulations. So I'm going to ask the policy team to come on now, and we're going to cover some of the major ones, and we'll have some time, I think, for questions, which we encourage you to submit through the Q&A channel. The topics that we want to cover briefly are Inspire, HOTMA, the new 30-day notice rule, and issues around tenant account receivables. So first joining us will be Crystal Wojciechowski to give us a brief summary of where we stand with respect to Inspire. Crystal?
Yes, thanks, Tim. So good morning, everyone. So I am going to give you just a few minute update on Inspire. Here we are on August 9th. We are officially 1 month into the official compliance date with Inspire. So just a quick couple sentence background. I was looking back at when I started with PHADA. We're coming up on 10 years now where Congress directed the department to align inspection standards due to the known challenges that we're aware of related to HQS and UPCS. And so here we are nearly 10 years later. Officially Inspire took effect, they're calling it a compliance date, on July 1st. And we now have all of the information that we had been hoping to receive, review and analyze. And that is the final Inspire rule. So all of these rules and subordinate notices came out over the last few months. So we have the final rule, we have the final standards, the final scoring notice, and the final administrative notice, which are all available on HUD's website. There is an Inspire webpage, has lots of really great information. But in addition to that, we have done an analysis of all of these notices as well. That's on PHADA's website, and in editions of the Advocate. Really the primary, the pivot with Inspire, there was a pivot to focus more on the interior of the unit, in areas where residents specifically spend most of their time, versus focusing on those exterior items like erosion and overgrown vegetation, and really just focusing on the health and safety of residents versus some of the larger point deducted items that were seen back in UPCS. So as I mentioned, Inspire officially, the compliance date, it went live on July 1st. Of this year. Over the last, particularly the last few years, but over the last 10 years since UPCSV and now Inspire, PHADA's really advocated diligently for delays to this. Though it has been a long journey, we really felt at the end that HUD was pushing out so many things at once too quickly, and we really wanted to have the industry and your agencies have time to train your staff, really take in and review the material and be truly prepared. Not just your staff being prepared, but software vendors, contract inspectors. And so we've advocated over the last couple of years really diligently. We were luckily able to win, that compliance date from July 1st. Technically, Inspire started officially on the 1st of April. So we were able to get a 3-month delay. So not as much as we had hoped, but still a delay nonetheless to enable your agencies to have more time to prepare. You didn't have much time because we just received all of those final standards. And HUD's official first Inspire inspection of record will begin allegedly tomorrow, is what we've been told. So just for your information and just to be aware of what kinds of inspections are coming down the pipeline, August 1st allegedly should be HUD's first Inspire inspection of record in the public housing department. So HUD has determined that they're going to focus first on about 150 high priority inspections this year. So those inspections include troubled agencies and developments that have not been inspected since they officially resumed after the pandemic on June 1st, 2021. So if your agency fits into that category, it's a very small number of agencies, you likely have received your 28-day notice. If you haven't, you should likely be receiving it soon. So after they have taken care of those 150 high priorities, they'll be focusing their inspection efforts on agencies with fiscal year end dates, first of 3/31 and then second of 6/30. And they're still utilizing that 3-2-1 rule related to the frequency of your pass or your physical inspections. So based on your last inspection score under UPCS would determine, whether you're getting an inspection 3 years later, 2 years later, or 1 year. And so take a look back at what your last UPCS inspection was, and then kind of work the numbers, figure out your fiscal year end, and that will give you a better idea of when your next inspection of record under Inspire will be. And if you want to send that information to me, I'll be glad to take a look, and we can guesstimate when your inspection might next occur so that your agency can be most prepared. And just to note that until all of your properties have been inspected under the Inspire protocol, your last pass indicator under FAS will be carried forward. So you won't get a new pass indicator until every development under your portfolio has been inspected. So that's just an FYI. If you participated in the demonstration, HUD should be reaching out to you to give you your score. Many agencies, that was one of our concerns, and that participated in the demonstration, they did not actually receive scores. So it was hard for you to provide feedback because you really didn't have the full information about how Inspire would affect your agencies and your FAS scores. So they should have reached out to you. They said by the 10th. So if by tomorrow you have not heard from HUD and you participated in the demonstration and had an inspection, please reach out to me so that we can ensure that you get those scores so you can utilize that to kind of plan for the future. And just in general, anytime your agency receives a 28-day notice for an Inspire inspection, please reach out to us. This first year, probably first 3 years of Inspire is really going to be, I think, a learning curve for the industry, for HUD, for inspectors, field offices. And so we'd really want to be kept in the loop so that we can best advocate for you. We still have many concerns. We felt that there were some gaps in specific details in the notices. And so there are many unanswered questions, and it really how the inspections play out in real time. Unfortunately, it will really it will give us more information about how Inspire is going to be implemented across the board. And so the more that you can keep us in the loop, the better we can advocate for you. So despite having answered some of our questions in the notices, there were still some gaps, particularly related to tenant-caused damages and tenant-owned appliances, also related to appeals and technical reviews, really important things that there was information was lacking in the notices, and we'll have to see how that plays out on the ground for us to be able to truly provide feedback to the department. And the department has been open, so the more feedback that we can provide to them as quickly as possible, the better that Inspire will ultimately be over time as this rolls out. And so everything I've mentioned about inspections upcoming, that's for public housing. So what about other programs? So a voucher program, so the housing choice voucher program, also multifamily, you will see Inspire take effect at those programs October 1st of this year. So we will see a few notices coming out for those programs specifically, kind of in addition to the administrative notice. So those are coming soon, and we'll provide updates as we receive them. Just a note, if you have a voucher program and you are concerned about that transition from HQS to Inspire, HUD has verbally stated that your agency can use HQS as an alternative inspection type for 1 year. So from 10/1 this year to 10/1/2024. They have only verbally stated this, so we do need to see it in writing in the notice, but that's just something to kind of be aware of, that you should be able to request to utilize HQS for a 1-year transitional period. So that will give you more time to really communicate with your landlords and just ensure that it doesn't have a detrimental effect on your voucher program and housing choice in your community. And so a few notices coming down the pipeline. In addition, a small and rural assessment requirements in public housing, we'll be looking for that notice. And a few other small programs like HOPWA, those notices will be coming down the pipeline, and we'll provide more details as we see those. And so I think I'm over my time, but just my final note is that the standards are out there, so you can prepare for inspections. by really getting your maintenance staff and even your administrative staff to be really aware of what the standards are, particularly those life-threatening deficiencies and severe deficiencies in units that will have the most impact on your score. And we have some checklists that we can provide you, some additional resources that have been made available under some of our previous conference sessions. And so if you would like some resources, please let me know. I can get those to you. And really, HUD has, I will give them credit, they have done a great job of putting everything on their website, including webinars and YouTube videos, get ready sessions that they had previously been across the country. They did record those. So that information is available on HUD's website. And if you need any assistance with that, please let me know. And just reach out to us if you need any help or if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. That was a lot to cover in a short period. I would just reiterate, a lot of this information is on our website and certainly in the advocate articles that Crystal has written. I'm glad you mentioned the voucher delay possibility. That is one of the questions that came in on the Q&A channel. Whether that has come out in writing as of yet, you pointed out HUD staff has stated it verbally many times. I think they've indicated it will be in writing. We'll certainly continue to press that, but certainly they're well on record as indicating that agencies will have an option to delay implementation of the voucher program. The next topic we want to cover, Michael Webb will go over the latest on HOTMA, the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act. We've been working very closely with the other national industry groups on this and have some significant concerns. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Hi, everyone, and good morning. To quote a recently departed former PHADA colleague, HOTMA is a hot mess. So just a bit of background for those of you who are newer to the industry. HOTMA was passed in 2016. And then earlier this year, HUD finally got around to putting out guidance for sections 102, 103, and 104. And there's about 12 sections in HOTMA that cover the housing programs that we deal with. So just very briefly, I'm going to talk about section 103 quickly. It only applies to public housing families that are over income. It became effective on June 14th, so your ACOPs were supposed to have been updated by then. Just briefly what it does, it increases the over income threshold to 120% of AMI, or 1.5 times the 80% AMI limit. Section 103 establishes notification requirements for families whose income exceed those limits, as determined through either an annual or an interim research. Families will get 24 months from their initial notification that they were OI to come back into compliance or to leave the program. If they lose over income status at any time during that 24-month period, and then they become over income again, their 24-month clock resets. So what housing authorities should have done, like I said earlier, is update their ACOPs by June 14th. There is a discretionary policy choice there, where families who exceed that 24-month period, they can either remain in their unit as a non-public housing over income family and pay a higher rent, or you have the option to evict them. Sections 102 and 104, which I would say are the hotter mess of the three sections. Section 102 concerns changes in income calculations, recertification procedures, and deductions. Section 104 concerns asset limits and eligibility for our programs. Both sections 102 and 104 apply to the voucher program, apply to public housing, they apply to various multifamily programs, and they also, parts of them, I should say, apply to the 3 H's. They apply to Housing Trust Fund, Home, and HOPLA. PHADA has had some very serious concerns about the implementation timeline for sections 102 and 104. When HUD initially put out the notice earlier this year, they stated that the effective date was for Jan 1, 24 research, which, you know, a Jan 1, 24 research is going to start in October, which would have meant that housing authorities would have needed to have their policies in place by October. PHADA and other industry groups wrote to HUD in May asking for a delay in implementation. And we held several meetings with department leadership expressing our concerns. As of about 2 weeks ago, HUD sent out an email to all EDs that while the quote unquote effective date for HOTMA remains Jan 1, 24. The quote unquote compliance date is Jan 1, 2025. The guidance is clear as mud right now, and we're still awaiting details in the implementation notice. So everything I say for the rest of this presentation is subject to change. Our understanding is that you'll need to update your admin plans in your ACOPs to comply with sections 102 and 104 by Jan 1, 24, so this upcoming January 1st. But you won't start using those policies until Jan 1, 25 at the latest. You should note that this will be a significant amendment, so you'll need public comment for those changes. Just a bit of behind the scenes here, really the holdup from HUD's perspective is what's called the Housing Information Portal, or HIP, which is the successor system to PIC, which was mentioned in the email that was sent to all the EDs pushing the compliance date back. And really with HIP, all the jokes write themselves. I have a sore hip, I have a bad hip, my hip needs replaced, my hip is shot. The challenge is that the HOTMA income calculation changes that are going into section 102 are only going to be programmed into HIP. They're not going to be programmed into PIC. So until HIP is rolled out, you can't have HOTMA income changes. And HIP is delayed. We don't know when HIP is going to be rolled out. The software vendors that many of you work with, the Yardis, the 10Mass, the MRIs, the Emphasis, they're having to adjust all their products on the back end. They're all up in arms about these changes with HIP. Hence why when you read that email that Rich Minacchio sent out about 2 weeks ago, they're saying something along the compliance date is Jan 1, 25 at the latest, but if your software vendor gets their product out before then, they're expecting you to implement HOTMA. So we're going to have agencies implementing HOTMA at different times, which I think, as I stated in a recent Advocate article, is just a recipe for disaster. And we're still awaiting more guidance from this from the department. In the meanwhile, aside from despair, there are resources out there that can help your agency get ready for HOTMA. So HUD hosted 2 webinars in May. Those are recorded and they're up on HUD Exchange. They are very basic. I would say if you know nothing about HOTMA, they're a great place to get started. I've written several Advocate articles that I think are a better job than those 2 webinars, but just my opinion. As of yesterday, HUD posted a list of discretionary policy choices that agencies have for sections 102 and 104. You can consult that. We're expecting what I'm referring internally as the big honkin' implementation notice for section 102 and 104 to be published this month, but HUD has been promising this since June, so who knows? The industry groups are actually about to send a letter, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, about asset limits and our concerns with those. And our team is going to continue to advocate for regulatory relief on HOTMA, greater clarity on the implementation, and more guidance. And just one final note as I close, HOTMA passed 7 years ago. We are still waiting on guidance on section 102, which deal with inspections and non-life-threatening deficiencies, and section 109, which I know many of our members are concerned about, which concerns the ability to have capital fund reserves. And we'll keep you guys updated in the Advocate as those progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, I want to reiterate, we invite questions through the Q&A channel on HOTMA or any of these issues. The next issue we want to cover is a new, or it's not new, but it's a regulation that we had anticipated would be going away when the COVID emergency ended. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I noted that one of the participants who's viewing the session today is our Senior Vice President, Sherry Lee, from Kentucky. Sherry brought this issue to my attention and immediately raised concerns about it months ago. And as a result of that, we discussed it at one of PHADA's conferences during committee sessions, and the board ultimately took a position on this matter. So I'm going to invite now David Weber to just give a brief summary of the 30-day notice and where we stand with that and some of PHADA's concerns. David?
Thanks, Tim. I hope my connection works better this time. The 30-day notice, as folks will recall, during COVID, HUD issued, their CARES Act required that tenants receive at least a 30-day notice of intent to evict, or however that is categorized in your locality or state. And in 2021, they actually issued an interim final rule to keep that 30-day notice requirement in place through the national emergency. That notice did say until rescinded by the secretary, and HUD has taken the position that that requirement remains in place for most of the programs. And they have repeatedly in a number of different contexts indicated their intent to issue a final rule establishing a 30-day notice of eviction for the public housing multifamily programs. We have continued to raise the concerns we have with this, with HUD, that it's not consistent with many state and local laws, that it can make it harder to collect rent, and also that it doesn't even always serve the tenants, as they end up just with a bigger owing balance when that eviction notice does get issued. We've really stressed the disconnect with local law, and not clear that it really helps evictions in the long run. However, I will say that HUD has continued to promote this change in their information about promoting tenant protections and in looking to that constituency. So it does appear that HUD will continue to require a 30-day notice of eviction in all of their project-based programs, including public housing. We will continue to stress with HUD the impact this may have on the ongoing TARS problem, which Michael will talk about in a second, and for relief, further relief, as they had last year in the FAS calculations related to TARS, as well as the real potential cash problem that some agencies are facing. So I think with that, we'll continue to push for consistency with local laws, but realistically, I think HUD is going to move forward with this. And Professor Armstrong, who's not with us today, has informed me that HUD's authority to do so was previously established when they set up the 14-day notice. So apparently they are going to be able to establish a 30-day notice requirement in those programs.
Thanks, David. I would just add a little bit. I recently met with the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Richard Minacchio, and talked to him about our concerns on this. The other issue is in the voucher program, concerns that this could lead to a loss of owner participation in that program. That was something that Sherry Lee immediately cited as a concern. And I think, David, it does, at least for the time being, continue in the voucher program, right?
Well, I've been trying to find confirmation of that, and it's not entirely clear. I'll continue to look for that. I actually suspect that one of the reasons the final notice has not been released is because of some internal discussion about whether it makes sense to apply, whether they could get away with applying it to the voucher program, or whether the negative impacts will be too severe.
So we'll report back further to members on that. But as you indicated, one of the things that we pointed out in our letter to HUD, which, by the way, we also sent to some key members of Congress, is concerns about how this could exacerbate the situation around tenant account receivables. And Michael Webb did an excellent letter for PHADA that we sent to the department after a recent briefing. And we've also alerted Congress to concerns about that. So Michael, would you take a few minutes and cover that topic?
Yeah, gladly, Tim. So as David mentioned, TARs are very closely related to the 30-day notice challenge. Just as a bit of background, tenant accounts receivable, for those of you not familiar or new to the industry, it's uncollected rent or rent that housing authorities are unable to collect. This has been rising since the pandemic began, really, and coincided with a lot of the eviction moratoria that were put in place. And as David mentioned, TARs are closely related to other housing authority challenges, the 30-day notice requirement, FOS scoring, which David mentioned, The department has provided relief previously, but is not committed to relief going forward, and that's something we continue to advocate for. And then probably the biggest picture, it has great impacts on your funding because the public housing operating fund formula is based on the rents charged, not the rents collected. So if you're unable to collect rent, that has a negative impact to your bottom line and to your reserves. So as Tim mentioned earlier, on behalf of our members, PHADA has really led the effort across the industry to bring TARS to HUD's and Congress's attention. In early 2022, PHADA surveyed its members, and that survey indicated that 43% of respondents, so nearly half, had TARS exceeding 40% of rental revenue, and that TARS were not related to housing authority operating performance pre-pandemic. In mid-2022, PHADA and other industry groups met with HUD, and HUD shared data based on 2021 FDS submissions that showed over half of housing authorities had seen, quote, significant increases in TARS. And I think this is the money quote here, 1 in 5 housing authorities were, in HUD's terms, severely impacted by TARS, meaning that they had increasing TARS and decreasing reserves. And we're worried here at PHADA that this number could be higher because a lot of housing authorities in 2021, 2022, their revenues were being buoyed by CARES Act payments and other pandemic forms of relief that have since expired. So about a month ago, PHADA and some other industry groups met with HUD. They gave us a presentation on current TARS levels based on 2022 FDS submissions. And what those data show, the big picture takeaway, is that TARS are still elevated based on where they were before the pandemic, and the situation has not improved. So if you look at across the entire public housing portfolio, TARS continue to rise. So this chart you've got here as total TARS across public housing. So you can see pre-pandemic, we're about 200 million. 2022, we're at 571 million. So 150% increase there. If we move to the next slide, we've charted out the percent of housing authorities that have TARS levels over 2.5% of rental revenue. So you can see 2018, 2019, you're looking at about 30%. Today, it's about half of housing authorities have TARS over 2.5%. And what you see here is that really between 2021 and 2022, the situation has not improved. I mean, we've got a rounding error from 49.4 to 48.4%. I mean, it's not a great improvement. And so what we're seeing here, again, TARS elevated through the pandemic, and the situation is not improving. So while we appreciated HUD sharing this updated data, PHADA, and especially PHADA, has 2 major concerns. So in our presentation, HUD did not provide an update on the number of severely impacted housing authorities. Again, those are ones that have rising TARS and decreasing reserves. We think that's a really important stat to show kind of the extent of the TARS problem, because if you're a housing authority that can't collect rent and your reserves are decreasing, that hurts your bottom line and that hurts your financial sustainability. And also, I think just generally a tonal concern we had with HUD's presentation is that the word they probably used the most often with TARS have stabilized. And again, if we go back to the previous slide, Sarah, I don't think the situation is stabilized. I mean, I don't think this is a new normal that any of us want to get used to. And also HUD continued to kind of emphasize that they believe TARS was mostly a NYCHA problem, which NYCHA does have rent collection concerns. But if you go to the next slide, sorry, I'm making you hop all over, Sarah. Again, this is a broad problem. We're looking at half of housing authorities across the country have TARS above that 2.5% threshold. So as Tim mentioned, we wrote a letter to appropriators and to HUD, sharing our concerns about TARS, asking them to ask HUD for more data, particularly the number of severely impacted agencies. We will continue to advocate for this. We'll continue to share that data in the advocate as well. I want to close very briefly on the shortfall funding notice. So HUD about 2 weeks ago put out a notice for shortfall funding. We wrote a breaking news for the advocate that's available on PHADA's website. It has a link. It's only 25 million total in terms of shortfall funding, and the priority is going to be smaller agencies first, and then kind of going up the ladder to bigger agencies until they run out of money. Just for reference, again, there's 25 million in shortfall funding. The total identified need for HUD is 337 million out there in shortfall. So the notice has a link of the eligibility, as well as reporting and expenditure guidelines. And the deadline for that funding is August 17th, so about a week from today, or a week from tomorrow, excuse me. And again, despite HUD knowing who is eligible, you still have to go into the OpFund portal and apply.
Thank you, Michael. I wanted to just, before we go to questions that Blake will pose, I want to mention that the recent editions of the Advocate have really good summaries of both the House and Senate appropriations bills that you can reference before you're setting up your meetings with Congress. As David Weber mentioned, in the next 2 days, we will be sending out to all members the new position papers on FY24 appropriations and some other legislative priorities. So you will have those by very early next week. They'll also be available on the PHADA website, and we'll certainly have them available at the PHADA Washington meeting next month. We, as I indicated, very much favor the most of the provisions in the Senate version of the bill. Without getting too much into detail, the funding for our programs, public housing, Section 8 RAD, are more favorable in the Senate version of the legislation for the most part. So Blake, we want to now turn to questions that have been posed to any of the panelists. So would you please recite those questions? And I would ask everybody to come back on screen if you would.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions here, along with a few that were submitted prior, which I'll get to. This first one is saying, if you update your administrative plan or your ACOP, then don't use the policies as adopted. You're subjecting yourself to potential litigation by not complying with your own policies. You don't just adopt policies at a housing authority that you're not going to implement upon adoption by the Board of Commissioners. Does anyone have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I actually basically asked that question during a meeting with some of the HUD folks, and they suggested that you could pass a change with a future effective date, which is awkward and would be tough for staff to navigate, but is one way to do that. That will, your board approves the change, but the change isn't effective until some point down the road. So that is HUD's answer as to how you do those things.
Thank you. Next question, any guidance on the recently dropped RAD supplemental notice?
Yeah, so we will have some a detailed coverage of that in the upcoming Advocate. It does provide for some additional flexibility in initial rent setting, particularly for PRAC 202 conversions under RAD, also under Faircloth to RAD, and there are some other streamlining and enhancement provisions that are included in the new notice. They've actually posted a version of the amended version of the revision 4 of the RAD notice that shows the deletions on the RAD website. Folks want to look at that themselves.
Next question, does HUD expect us to begin Inspire public housing self-inspections before the new standards are integrated by our software provider?
Yes, I'll answer that. So Sarah, I would want to go back to the administrative notice to get more specifics about the rollout, the implementation of that, and the timing for your agency. However, I will note that HUD has been pretty clear that even if your software provider does not have that, ready for you to go at this time, that HUD is providing a version of the software for you to be able to utilize. And they really did that because there are still some agencies that don't utilize software programs for their inspections. So there is that is available on HUD's website. But let me get some additional information for you on the rollout. And also, I think just a good note for us to maybe follow up with some of the software vendors to find out where they are in that process.
These next couple of questions are advocacy related and directed towards Mark and Terry. The first question is, what are some examples of using personal stories to have what are some examples that you could give in using personal stories that have an impact in advocacy?
So I'll go first. I think as we talk to the representatives, veterans are good examples of personal stories. If you can visit with a member of that group and get a personal story about how, in our case, we do a lot of veterans homeless programs. And so those veterans that have been homeless because of varying circumstances and now can live in one of our public housing developments or one of our supportive housing programs. And oftentimes it's easy to have the representative be able to meet with them during a tour or have a staff person meet with them during a tour. Those are very good opportunities. Terry, do you have any other examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a few. So one, I believe that we have to put a face to affordable housing. And so as we talk with our representatives, we always make it a personalized story. You know, we're working and we're helping to serve the waitress. We're helping to serve city employees, laborers. And that is something that they can definitely relate to. Also looking at the historical significance of the work that we lift up. Atlanta was one of the first cities to eliminate traditional public housing. And a lot of our developments, the first public housing project for white households was built here in Atlanta, and the first public housing project for African Americans was also built here in Atlanta. And so being able to relate to that historical significance, even though it was a segregated environment, how we were able to eliminate that segregated environment to inclusivity also tells a powerful story. And then most recently at our site visit, well, not site visit, I'm sorry, our ceremony to accept the award for the Choice Neighborhood Grant application, we had a former resident actually participate in the ceremony and to tell her story as to what it meant to her to not only be a resident of a previous public housing project, but to still be a recipient and a beneficiary of the work that's being done. So definitely putting a face and humanizing the work that we do, I think is relatively important. And that's just not important for working with your legislators. I also think it's important as we look to tell our story and leverage the ability to have philanthropic dollars come in and really help participate in lifting up some of the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. It says, I've never reached out to my representative. Where should I start?
Okay, so I would start two ways. So Mark talked a little bit about the website where you can go in and sort of request a meeting. I definitely think you should do that, but I would also reach out to the local office and understand who those local players are and start a conversation with the local office as you work to try to set a meeting in Washington. I always believe in starting at home first, because sometimes that can also help to make a way for you to be able to have a larger conversation.
I agree with Terry. Just pick up the phone and make a call. That's the easiest thing. That's their job, is to meet with you. And so just pick it up and make the call, just like you're calling any other individual you might be calling that day.
And a follow-up to this is, if I've reached out to my representative and I've not responded, what would be a good next step?
So
for me,
go ahead.
Well, go ahead, Mark.
No, you go ahead.
Well, and Atlanta is a larger city, but for me, when we do not get a response, I usually start with City Hall and understand the city typically has a legislative office, and I work through that legislative office to make sure I can get the contact or receive a response back. But in a smaller city, if you don't have that type of access, I would say that every representative knows somebody. And so you just need to figure out and find out who has a contact with that representative that could actually be of help to you in being able to make contact.
I agree. I mean, using other folks, other organizations in town, that's how we got Representative Bice to tour one of our developments, was through the local food bank. She had a relationship with them and they helped us get that contact.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Our next question, it's kind of a comment, I think related to this. It's very helpful to share dollars your agency brings in your community with representatives. Data on family serves, waiting list numbers, and dollar amounts to private landlords in your local economy. I think that's just additional advice. Our next question is regarding the 30-day notice. Is there any data showing the connection of the additional funding that would be needed for public housing in the operating fund based on the increase in TARs and having to give the 30-day notice? And a follow-up, is there any data about how many families on waiting lists could be housed?
So we continue to push HUD for more data about TARs. I think it's really to see how many are impacted by increased TARs and decreased in cash flows. It'll be very difficult, I think, to show a direct link between the 30-day notice and the TARs amounts. I also do want to clarify, currently HUD is interpreting the CARES Act requirement of a 30-day notice as continuing to apply. So because of that interpretation, it does continue to apply to the voucher program. The interim final rule, however, would not apply to the HCV program. So there's two sides of this. It's unclear how they will shake out. But certainly for public housing and multifamily, it certainly appears the 30-day notice will be with us for some time to come. And we will continue to press HUD for more data and also for relief on the voucher side about that.
It occurred to me, David, we had shared the 30-day notice letter that we sent to HUD with the membership, but I think we'll make a point to make sure members have that for the September meeting when they're setting up their sessions with their senators and their representatives. Blake, I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar. We'd like to thank all of you for attending today and remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available later today on PHADA's website, along with the resource documents. And a reminder that PHADA's 2023 Legislative Forum will be taking place September 17th through 19th in Washington, D.C. Registration information and the conference agenda are available on PHADA's website. And as a reminder for those who've not yet registered but plan to attend, the hotel room block will closes this Friday. So this does conclude PHADA's webinar, and we'd now like to invite everyone today to please take our short survey. We appreciate your participation and your feedback. Thank you all very much.